now, I am thrilled to welcome Sharon Salzberg, author of numerous books and creator of the podcast The Meta Hour and co-founder of the Insight Meditation Society. Joining Sharon is our moderator, Courtney E. Martin, co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network and Fresh Speakers Bureau. She's authored several books, including The New Better Off, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Bright Magazine, and the On Being Project, among others. Welcome, Sharon and Courtney.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I am Courtney Martin, and I am so honored and lucky to be interviewing Sharon Salzberg. Kiski, it was so good of you to mention these real times we're living in, this sort of apocalyptic energy that I think the whole nation, the whole globe to some level is feeling, but has been particularly alive for us here in the Bay Area today. For those who don't live here, the skies were this like dark orange, eerie color this morning. And I woke up feeling my nervous system just totally charged and kind of this fight or flight mode. And I thought, if there was ever someone I wanted to be in conversation with when I couldn't soothe my own nervous system and like talk it into chilling out, it is Sharon Salzberg. So I feel like this is sort of a very lucky moment that I get to be in conversation with you, Sharon. And I'm sure a lot of people are feeling that too, that to listen to you today feels extra important. So thank you for being with those of us who come from everywhere, but I know this is particularly a Bay Area crowd today. As was mentioned, you can ask Sharon your own questions by putting them in the Q&A box. I'll give you guys a little indication when I'm going to move into that zone. But first I wanted to just get started with, as I was reading this book, which I just loved, I devoured it. And I don't get to devour a lot of books because I have small children and like a million other things going on. So when I get to devour a book, it's like such a special experience. I kept thinking, how much of this did she write before 2020? Because so much of it was just like so apropos of the moment we're experiencing, and how much of it was after sort of the true calamities of 2020 surfaced. Can you start with that? When did you write this book, and what was the first impetus for doing so?
Sure. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And Courtney, thank you so much for guiding me through this. And it's just great to see you again. I'm tuning in from Barre, Massachusetts, and all day long, friends in the Bay Area have been sending me photos of the sky. And I first looked at it and I thought, what is that? Like, what's wrong? And it is kind of amazing just to see the series of everything that's happening. So my heart is really with you all. I wrote the book, oddly enough, before 2020. And I had long wanted to write it for a number of different reasons. It really is a book I've wanted to write for a long time. There's a part of me that's been very involved with activists. And actually, even before that, so much of my recent work has actually been with caregivers, starting in 2004 with domestic violence shelter workers, and then directors and supervisors of shelters, and international humanitarian aid workers, people say working in the Syrian refugee camps, and then back here, these days with medical frontline people, ambulance drivers, doctors, nurses. And I saw so many similarities between activists and caregivers in that, one can look at this country or look at this world and say, we really need some empathy. It's like a cold, cruel world. But these people have lots of empathy. They care so deeply, and they're burning out for other reasons. And so that was part of what I wanted, was based on that work with caregivers, to say, okay, maybe these tools of meditation, mindfulness, loving kindness can actually be a source of renewal and replenishment as you are so directly working with suffering. And then, of course, I've got my own crowd, of meditators, people who I've just seen through the years. I believe so strongly that meditation will elicit a sense of compassion. I've heard so many times, I think I put this in the book, somebody will say to me, I started meditating and then I took a walk and somebody came up to me on the street and asked me for $1. And I gave them $1 because that's what I do. And this was the first time I ever looked that person in the eye and realized that was a human being. But what doesn't necessarily happen is that this person, newly kind of awakened, will then ask, what's the housing policy in the city that has so many people living on the street? And so I felt like, well, wouldn't it be wonderful to try to take these committed, compassionate people and help them see a path to really try to make a difference? I turned in the book, I think it was December. And then the pandemic happened, and then the protests happened. But before the protests, just after the pandemic, a friend of mine was reading it to excerpt it somewhere. And he said to me, I think he liked the book. And yet he said, I read those examples and I kept thinking, that's what made you anxious? Wait till you see what's coming. So then I went back to the publisher and I said, would it be okay if I wrote a preface to somehow try to contextualize this? So the preface is the only part that came later.
Wow, that is amazing. I mean, you talk about grief and rage as an example. I wanted to read one of the kind of opening quotes. You said, I've learned that meditation can provide tools to help courage grow out of rage and resilience out of grief. And, you know, what has 2020 been for anybody, I think, more than rage and grief? I mean, and across the spectrum, that's not just like one kind of person. I just feel like all these variations on that. But it brings up the most fundamental question that I know you address in the book and have addressed in so many of your books. But I think the mistake people make about meditation when they haven't had a lot of experience with it is thinking it is a very inward looking thing, that it's not about looking outward. It's not about action. It's not about engagement. And this book is, you know, totally blows that out of the water. But will you say a little bit about that, how something that seems so inward looking is actually an outward action in its own way?
Well, I've always felt like meditation was a skills training. And oddly enough, I think it isn't really odd. One of the skills is actually connection, because you may be all alone and you may have your eyes closed. You look like the picture of isolation and maybe aloofness. But what happens, I found over and over and over again, because I've been teaching for like 70,000 years now. You know, I've been teaching since 1974. The more we connect with ourselves deeply, truly, the more we understand that the nature of life is connection, that we are interconnected. That is one of the reasons that something like compassion, which could be seen as sort of stupid and saccharine and weak, it's actually a strength because it's reflecting the truth of how our lives are all connected. And I've been, for years, somebody actually sent me a quote of me from like 10 years ago, which is always an interesting experience. And something I have said over and over again is that it's not just kind of a meditative understanding that shows us that we are all connected. Science shows us this. Economics shows us this. Environmental consciousness certainly shows us this. And even epidemiology shows us this. So I've always talked about epidemiology because of my friends who are epidemiologists. And people used to say to me, what's epidemiology? Why are you using that word? I don't know what that means, you know? But here we are. It's almost like the terrible face of interconnection, which is also, I mean, it's just, it is, you know, whether we like it or not. That's actually the nature of things. And we just find it so deeply as we pay attention to ourselves. We suddenly find, wow, look at that. You know, however alone I might feel or cut off I might feel, the truth is that our lives are all connected. And how we then respond is where we have choice. It's where we have power. I should also say that doesn't mean we like everybody or that we're going to, as we used to, you know, invite them over. You know, and so even then we might not have invited them over. There's discernment, there's discretion, there's wisdom. There are all kinds of factors that come into play. But in terms of that sense of self and other and us and them, we can see it's just a construct. And that what happens over there doesn't nicely stay over there. And what we do, it matters. Because it too will ripple out in these lines of connection. And so I think we also need meditation, like for some rest. Because the other thing that, when you're talking about rage and grief, my mind then went, and exhaustion, because I feel like I've watched that arc very strongly. First anxiety, and then grief, and then rage, actually, and then exhaustion. We're so tired, and no wonder. And if you're actually trying to make a difference, or, being with your kids, trying to make a difference in your family, or just trying to get through the day successfully, or you're working, or you're home, or whatever it might be, we need some sense of respite. But that's not selfish or self-centered. That's just reality. It's like we need it.
Yeah. Oh, we need it. You're reminding me of one of my favorite, there's so many bad things about social media, but one of the best things about social media for me has been this new site called the Nap Ministry. Have you ever seen this?
No.
I think you should check it out. I think you would love it. It's sort of like taking on some of Audre Lorde's ideas about, self-care as a political act. And they put up all these great quotes and kind of reminders, which is something you also get into, is sort of reclaiming self-care as something that is a political act and can lead to more enlightened, more truly compassionate action. And you talk about your own journey. You wrote, I was hoping to find relief from my own personal suffering, but that journey formed the foundation for my lifetime of work and service in the world. And I was thinking a lot about that as I was reading, and how it feels like some people, and maybe, with certain kinds of personalities, or maybe all of us at different moments, get sort of stuck in the self-help mode, get sort of stuck in the personal growth mode, and can't get into that thing you're talking about, which is that connection mode. Like, okay, I'm working with my own suffering and now I'm moving into the world. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, do you think that there's a way to keep yourself moving along, or any sort of like trigger warnings to look for when, of course, privileged people can do this more easily because we're the ones who can sort of like consume a lot of books or webinars, or sort of be in that retreat mode, or, that I'm thinking of sort of the cliche of that. But just wondering if you have any thoughts about how to move past, or is it always something you're doing simultaneously, the sort of personal transformation and the public out there political work, and you just need to make sure you have...
Because otherwise, then there's a feeling like I'm done, Now I can just go take care of everybody else. And that would, I think, be an unfortunate feeling to be walking around with. So I think to some degree, it's always, they're both going on. And I think they should both be going on. But I think part of the issue is that we may not have many models, but we have some. And so I feel very lucky. I did have a model. It was this woman who was one of my teachers. She's actually the person who told me to teach. And so in a way, I have a kind of direct sense of lineage, from her. And she was a woman who had suffered tremendously in life. She's an Indian woman. Her name was Deepa Ma, or Deepa's mother. It's kind of like a nickname. Terrible suffering in a variety of different ways, including losing 2 children and her husband dying very suddenly. And she was living in Burma at the time, and she was so grief-stricken that she went to bed. She developed a heart condition, and she couldn't get out of bed. And her doctor came and said, you're going to have to do something about your mind, or you'll actually die of a broken heart. You should learn how to meditate. And so she got out of bed, and she went to the temple, and she learned how to meditate. And somehow what happened for her was that she, in a way, metabolized all of that pain and suffering into compassion. And she emerged as just the most loving, compassionate person with a broad, inclusive sense of who mattered, because she knew anybody had a life that could just turn on a dime like that. And I just saw her through the years with so many different kinds of people, and everyone, sort of like I say in the book, and as is true, my icon is sort of the Statue of Liberty. So she was like she was very short, a very tiny little Statue of Liberty. Everyone was welcome. Everybody had a place. Everyone belonged. Everyone could find a home with her. And I saw that, she didn't just emerge kind of peaceful and able to cope. And she emerged with this power to really affect others just through her being. And somebody wrote a book about her, which I think the second version is called Deepen. And I just felt it would be a hard thing to write because some people, some wise people, poets, teachers, they say one sentence and it just sort of turns your whole perception. She wasn't like that. It was all her being, her incredibly loving presence. And I thought it's like all the same story. Like I felt really miserable. I went to see her. I felt really good. Like it's not going to make a great book, but it did make it really nice. But she told me to teach and she was my model. This is what it's really about is the effect that you can have on others. And I think we need more. We need more people like that in the meditative world so that it doesn't become that sort of self-satisfied activity.
Mm-hmm. And did she model, I get how she modeled over a lifetime, like you look at her whole span of lifetime, but on a daily basis, was it like, and I wonder if this is true for you, like a day in the life of Sharon, like, is it like you have your time where you have your own meditation practice and your own inner work of like, oh, this is where I'm getting stuck lately. And then you're out in the world? Or is it like you have a season of going more inward and then you're able to be like, okay, I'm good for a while. Like I can be more out in the world. I don't need as much time looking at myself.
Well, I do practice every day. And I think that is really the source of being able to be out the rest of the day.
Yeah.
I in a way I do have a season because I go on retreat when I can. It's been a while now. But mostly my life has this daily pocket, of just practicing. And then the rest of the time I'm super engaged.
Yeah. So I want to talk about anger because that for me both was such a great part of the book and also very personally, I've been like in this mood of getting in touch with my anger and like trying to really understand anger. And I also find, by the way, when I write about anger, it's the most, people are so attracted to it, which I find fascinating because for me, it's kind of like this thing that I'm personally still trying to get comfortable with expressing. And then to have people respond in such a big way is really interesting to me of sort of the zeitgeist. It feels, you talk about how can you feel the anger and then move through it, not ignore it and not like seize upon it and get attached to it. That seems like the muscle for our moment, man. Like that is really hard to do. And it just seems like could quite possibly be like one of the most important things for all of us to do in this moment in 2020 in September, like staring down an election, staring down all these like deep political differences. Say more about it. Like how have you seen the most skillful people harness their anger rather than getting stuck in it or squashing it and saying like, this is unenlightened, which I think is such a kind of Buddhist-y. Another thing that people misunderstand about Buddhism is that like, it's unenlightened to feel anger if you're Buddhist. And so if you're feeling anger, then it's like an immature thing that you're doing.
Yeah, it's pathetic. I mean, that's not a commentary on them. That's a commentary on how one can view anger.
Right. Like if I was really enlightened, I would be able to like sail above all of this and like, what's wrong with me that this is pissing me off?
That's right. Exactly. So, it is a very delicate dance. It's a very kind of classical teaching in a way. One of my favorite ways of describing mindfulness actually came from an article in the New York Times years and years ago about an Oakland school, 4th grade classroom, which was having a pilot program in mindfulness. And so they asked one of the kids who's in 4th grade, so we'll assume he's 9 or 10 years old, they said, "What is mindfulness?" And he responded by saying, "Mindfulness means not hitting someone in the mouth. That's what mindfulness means." And I thought that is a great definition of mindfulness because it implies all the skill you just talked about, knowing we're feeling angry when we're starting to feel angry, right? Not after we've sent the email, not after we've yelled at somebody, but as it's beginning because we're that in touch. It also implies a certain balanced relationship to the anger because if we get completely consumed by it and defined by it, will probably hit a lot of people in the mouth because life can be really frustrating. But at the same time, if we're ashamed of what we're feeling and we don't think it should be there and we've lost control, it's terrible, and we just try to stuff it down, we'll explode. And so we talk about mindfulness as that place in the middle, and that's actually the training. You sit with the painful feeling as best as possible, not judging it, not adding shame and dread and all of those things, but it's really like you're saying, what is it? What is anger? Mm-hmm. And when I've done that, I see it's so complex a feeling. It's so intricate a feeling, strands of fear, strands of sadness, strands of grief, strands of regret. And almost always I find that kernel of helplessness that the anger is actually in response to. And if I can get there, then I know I have to do something, one thing, whatever it is, even if it seems small, even if it seems meager, even if it seems insufficient. And that's how I channel the energy. Because the positive part of the anger is the energy. And sometimes there is a great truth telling. You know, we all know we can be in a meeting or something, and it's the angriest person in the room that's saying, look at that. And everyone else is very determined not to look there, you know?
Yeah.
But they are the ones who are really insisting. And yet it can consume people and take over their lives. And when I was writing the book, I decided, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I want to quote Gandhi when he said, if you get lost in anger, and again, I want to make the distinction between feeling anger and just being overcome by anger. If you get lost in anger, it's like drinking poison, thinking you're going to kill the other guy.
Right.
So I looked it up because I wanted to quote it, and I never saw it attributed to Gandhi at all. I saw it attributed to the Buddha and Oprah Winfrey and the Big Book of AA and Nelson Mandela and Carrie Fisher, and I have no idea who said it. You know, but that's kind of the point. It's like out of kindness to ourselves, we want to find a way to channel that energy and utilize it.
Yeah. And gets back to your point about connection, right? Of that if helplessness is the like most root part of it, you know, I've heard also, who knows who originally said this, but if you feel helpless, help somebody. And that's been so true for me at like my, you know, worst moments. If I can like look outward and just connect with someone, even if it's not helping them, but just like on the street, have a conversation with a stranger, it's like you feel your whole mood shift because you've connected and gotten out of that helpless place of taking some kind of action. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I found so fascinating the piece about systems thinking and kind of network looking that you talked about, because that's a big part of, I feel like, my trajectory as an activist and as a thinker has been, you know, starting out, you know, as a kid of the 80s and 90s, sort of raised to like feel empathy for particular things, or kind of like, you know, I'm going to recycle, or, you know, having these like very sort of one-off notions of what it meant to make change in the world. And the older I've gotten, the more I feel like I've understood systems, and had like, you know, just continually trying to develop my systemic literacy around like how the root of problems and how do you actually make solutions that are like contextualized and help a lot of people and are effective. And I loved that you wrote about both systems thinking and network looking, which is something I haven't seen a lot of like Buddhist or spiritual literature about. And you talk about this notion of clear comprehension, or sampajana. Can you talk more about that? I would love to learn even more than was in the book about kind of, and I had a sense that felt pretty fresh to you too. Like, was that a hard chapter to write? Have you seen many folks like drawing all those connections you were drawing?
No, I haven't seen many folks doing that. And I did a strange loop in the book, because a lot of what the trajectory was, you know, moving from anger to courage, moving from grief to resilience, remembering to take in the joy, which is another whole thing to talk about.
Yeah.
Seeing interconnection, and then having this kind of systems thinking. That's like if that person on the street were to ask, what's the housing policy in this city?
Yes,
so that there's so many people on the street. But then I looped around because the book ends with somebody helping his father, you know, in a very personal, direct way, in a situation where his father was an alcoholic. He had been living on the streets. He was not then living on the streets, but he was dying. And, and I thought, oh, I did a funny loop. Look at that. Because it's almost like the vision or the view, I think, behooves us to be as broad and expansive as possible. And the actions may be very immediate and direct, because that's what's real in front of us, that person, that situation, whatever it might be. And that's where we put our energy. So sampajanya, it's actually very classical Buddhist teaching that the word sati, S-A-T-I, which is translated as mindfulness, is actually a compound. It's sati sampajanya. It's mindfulness and clear comprehension. But many times in these days, mindfulness is largely popularized for the benefit, which is an enormous benefit that it brings, of helping us inhabit our lives. We can be so disconnected and distracted and all over the place. We don't really taste the tea as we're drinking it. We don't really feel what's happening in the moment as it's happening. We're just kind of somewhere else, very fragmented. And so that benefit of mindfulness, of actually having us live fully, is what's really celebrated and so appealing. But classically, mindfulness is not just for inhabiting our lives, it's for understanding our lives. That's the clear comprehension part. This way of being so ungenerous, so separate, let's say, which I thought was going to make me strong. Look at it as it appears in the moment, just like I was talking about myself looking at anger, sitting and being with it in truth, right? Oh, this is what it's like, right? And so that habit that I've been cultivating because I thought it would keep me safe, look at that. It's made me so lonely. Or look at that. I thought compassion was so stupid. And, people only take advantage of you. Look at how I feel when I connect. Look at how I feel when I listen. So we really pay attention to what makes us suffer, what brings us a sense of genuine fulfillment. We pay attention to how alone we actually are compared to what we project. So I also tell the story in the book about driving in a car with a friend, and we were stuck in terrible, awful, hideous traffic, complaining about it bitterly the whole time. And then my friend turned to me and said, well, we're the traffic too, And I thought, oh, you're right. They're complaining about us. And I thought, what a funny sense. Talk about privilege. Like, it's my road. You are an interloper. You're slowing me down. So like I am in the center of the stage. You are on the margins in my way. But what about if that sense of centrality drops? Because it's not true.
Right.
And we see, oh, we're all the traffic. Here we are together.
Right. That's so interesting. I was thinking about, I've been a part of a lot of like philanthropic or like I'm working on something right now where we're kind of trying to come up with this list of amazing people who work in the care system. And so, we'll be on these spreadsheets with all these smart people, everyone's got 2 Ivy League degrees, and we're going through these spreadsheets, judging the shit out of everybody. And we're like, well, has that person's, what's the scale of their work? Have they saved X number of people? Well, is this model actually, and I'm thinking, like, if we took even a moment, I mean, I would like to see that whole process infused with a sense of mindfulness and a sense of like the profundity of all of that work. But even if we took a moment in the beginning of the call to say, like, each one of these people we are discussing is waking up every morning and doing the work we're talking about, like, just to like take it in. So in some ways it's like, in addition to this muscle around like processing anger and getting us out in the world, I feel like another piece of our moment is the aperture almost. It's like, how do you have this aperture, which is like, and you talk about the starfish metaphor, like how do you keep reminding yourself that like anything anyone does for anybody to make the world more kind and human and like gentle is wonderful. And we do need to think about scale, and we do need to make sure that like we don't get so abstract, so granular that we lose what it means to actually change systems. So it meant a lot to me to think about mindfulness and meditation as a tool for that aperture building? Like, how do you keep getting big and getting little, getting big and getting little? Because I think some people are only in the big space and some people are only in the little space, and then they can't see each other. And we would get so much further if either in one body we were able to do that, or if we were able to like work together more. Does that making any sense?
It makes a lot of sense, because I face it a lot in the mindfulness world, where these days there can be a tremendous emphasis on scale.
Yeah.
As though that were the only value. And, you know, it isn't necessarily, I mean, it's never been that way, you know, that it needed to be a mass movement. It was usually a transmission person to person, you know, and it may be a smaller group of people going deep, and then their work is with a larger group of people. But, you know, it's often the case these days that it feels like, oh, it's only if you are reaching masses of people, you know, that it's worth it, that it's effective. And it's interesting for me because I see sacrifices perhaps being made in order to accomplish that. Like, you know, what does it mean to be a teacher? You know, and like I teach because my own teacher told me to teach, and I thought it was ridiculous. You know, when Deepen said to me, "You're going to go back," I was going back to the States in 1974 for what I thought was a very brief period before I went back to India for the entire rest of my life. And she said, "When you go back, you'll be teaching." I said, "No, I won't." And she said, "Yes, you will." I said, "No, I won't. I won't." And she said, "Yes, you will." I said, "No, I won't." You know, that's very different than seeing it as a career path, for example.
Yeah.
Which it might be seen now. And people say,
or even
to me,
worse, a brand. Like, really,
or a brand.
Like, how are you? What's the platform? What's the brand?
That's right.
Like getting really
That's
lost in some of that.
Yeah, no, it's very different. It's very, very different. And it's also, you know, that feeling, well, it's like what I was saying before. I don't personally ever want to feel I'm done.
Yeah.
You know, like I've gotten the degree in mindfulness and now I'm, you know, able to just teach forever and never be a student again or something like that. I think that would be really a big mistake. And you can kind of see it, you know, just as this, especially as this emphasis on scaling gets to be primary, because you need to do that in order to have enough instructors and have enough intervention. And people join in that out of the best motivations and out of the goodness of their heart. But I think it's the wrong message to be sending them.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll go to audience questions. So you all who are listening in, I'm sure you have a lot. Let's talk about joy, because you mentioned that chapter and that's such an important piece. You know, I think 2020 for a lot of people has felt devoid of joy, depending on what their whole sheltering in situation is. You know, I've been lucky enough and unlucky enough at other times, but lucky enough on the joy front to shelter in with two small humans whose like imaginations are running wild and just like constantly pulling me out of my grief around everything that we're reckoning with and facing. What's giving you joy this year? I mean, what do you see as, for people who don't have small children or some of these like very obvious sources of joy, how do you see people using mindfulness and this tool to stay joyful?
Stay joyful may be a bridge too far. You know, return to joy, or remember joy now and then, I think is probably more real. I think it's a lot of things. You know, it's funny. I'm a big fan of New Year's Eve. I always liked it, and I thought,
that's my birthday, Sharon.
Really? Oh,
yes.
No, I will always celebrate you as well. It's true.
Yeah.
Like, I always felt really lucky that as a Jew and a Buddhist and an American, I get 3 a year. And it's just this moment of like, wow, you know, new beginnings, and maybe last year was rough and we can let go of it. And here at the Insight Meditation Society, we used to have this ritual of burning the calendar month by month, and with commentary like, oh, that, you know, February was really not great, but March was, you know, like, and so somebody just sent me a message. It was a new message, but on the bottom was the message they'd sent me on New Year's Eve. 2020, and it was like, how great 2020 is arriving. And 2019 was so tough, and I can't wait. I'm breathless with anticipation. God. So no, it is very tough. And I think it's, for a lot of people, the hardest thing about finding the joy or letting in the joy is knowing that it's okay.
Yeah.
Truly. And if we can remember that, then, it's very personal. I'm not with small children. I'm mostly alone all the time. I came up here in mid-March thinking it was for 2 weeks, and I'm still here. But I'm so lucky I have a home here as well as an apartment in New York. And I have incredibly fulfilling work that I can do. Mm-hmm. And I have nature, and I have, it's like all around me. And I have people who are so inspiring for me as I work, like those doctors, those nurses, the people on the front lines. They really do inspire me, and I feel incredible joy from that. And I watch them remembering joy. Mm-hmm. And so it can be anything, whatever it is, but it feels like it's so wrong and selfish. But I think it's part of what makes us resilient. And we have to understand that it's just surreal what people are going through, all of us. And we have to bear that in mind and give ourselves a break and allow ourselves to take in the joy.
Yeah. And don't you think there's some connection between like absurdity and joy? Like there's sort of there's been a vibe, at least in my household this year, of just like, mm-hmm. Are you kidding me? Like, every new layer is just like, we got to laugh because this is just getting absurd. And then in that sort of like looking around at each other, like, no way, there's actually some joy of just like, at least we're dealing with this like total absurdity together. Like we're on a team, and so there's been some laughter there. And then the gratitude and grief coin, right? Like that it's like, there's so much to grieve. And then knowing that we're grieving because like, we really love this country, and we're grieving because this country was rooted in like the most horrific racism that we're all still dealing with the wounds of. And so the gratitude on the other side of this, like maybe we're actually going to reckon with it now. There's some relief in some of the grief, it seems like too, right?
Yeah. There's some quote in the book, I can't remember exactly who said it, but and asking myself was, what's still true? Like as everything is falling apart and disrupted and crazy and chaotic, what's still true? Like what is upholding me no matter what? And that's really what I was writing in the preface. And in a way, that's what the whole book is about. Actually, what's still true?
Wow.
And we can find that. We really can, each of us.
That's so
and
beautiful.
I think it's like love of country, you said it, the ideals, the possibility. It's worth loving. That love is still true.
Yeah.
As a possibility.
That's beautiful. Kiski, I'm going to pass over to you to give us some audience questions if you've got some good ones there.
I do. All right. First one is from Cynthia. She says, I'm a Zen practitioner, which emphasizes non-duality. And I'm wondering if you think about mindfulness meditation and political activism as distinct practices or even opposites, or as different expressions of compassion. Is it important that each individual do each in a balanced way, or is the balance something that humanity as a whole holds? All right, that's it.
Well, thank you for the question. It gives me an opportunity to go off on my thing about voting, because I have a very, very, very big thing about voting and how important it is. And not everyone sees social engagement as political engagement. And in fact, one of the things that came up when I was writing the book, I was having a conversation with Bell Hooks, and she said to me, I said to her, I know many Buddhist scholars who have the habit through their scholarship of like parsing words and being exact and precise and shifting words around. And I tell her she's even worse, which is probably why she's such a great writer. And she said to me, I don't like the term social action. because I think it's too limited. It makes people think only of marching and protesting and things like that. She said to me, what about art? You know, something that dissolves our sense of the convenient and the conventional and brings us into new terrain and shows us possibilities. She said, that's social action too. And so I tried to write the book very much in that spirit, you know, of a very broad view. But for me, political action is very much a part of my mindfulness practice. I think that voting is very close to the Buddhist tradition of saying everybody has innate dignity, everybody has innate worth, which means everyone should have a voice and that we need to be able to express that voice. And so most of my own action, especially these days, is going into that. Some people really do separate them. They're very divorced from one another, and people see politics as squabbling or something, you know. But I really see it as that honoring of the innate dignity. And I think it's very important not to confuse compassion with weakness or giving in. That I also, there's a quote from me in the book where I say something like, compassion doesn't mean we don't fight, it means we don't hate. Mm. And so I think strongly engaging in a political framework can be done with a lot of compassion in one's heart. And it's different. It's actually more sustainable, I think.
I want to pick up on one other thing Cynthia said, which was non-duality. And I really wanted you to talk about that because I've been thinking so much about how binary and dualistic things are feeling right now. And, you know, you wrote about, for example, this meditation minute you started around kids who are in detention, and you got all this pushback on social media about, like, is this making light, you know, this is a minute of meditation for this thing. And what about all these other systemic ways to attack this? And you said all of these things, you know, and it feels like we are in such a moment politically and culturally where people are thinking so dualistically. And I wonder, can you just talk about how meditation gets people out of that? How can it help people hold a bigger spectrum?
Yeah. I think it does exactly that, you know, that it gives us a chance to, first of all, hold various points, but not necessarily in opposition to one another or rigidly, and to kind of get bigger and to realize, okay, maybe both things are possible. I also tell a story in the book about some of my work in Parkland, Florida, with people who've been affected by gun violence and, you know, that school shooting. And the first time I went down there a few years ago, this young woman raised her hand in the retreat, and she said, you know, I feel really weird because I am having this incredible experience being here and learning, and it's so wonderful. And I know the only reason it's happening is because that horrible thing happened. And I don't know how to get over that to appreciate this. And I said, I don't know that we ever get over it, but we learn to hold them both. And I see exactly what you're describing, you know, in that kind of binary way of thinking. A friend of mine, and look at the division that's being offered to us between dealing with the pandemic or saving the economy.
Right.
You know, getting back to work, getting the economy up and running. And the friend posited that to me, like, well, we can't just stay sequestered, those of us who are able to be sequestered, because we have to, you know, we have to do this. And I said, well, why is it either or, you know? Maybe the government should be supporting people so that they can stay sequestered, that we can do something, you know, that has a long-term vision about the virus. And, you know, but we get into this very binary thinking, and it's fed to us. I think that's really what's offered to us. And I think meditation does exactly that by creating some space. Like going back to the kid who decided not to hit someone in the mouth, you know, he's still angry, perhaps, but there's some space around it. And in that space, that's where creativity can arise, or different options can arise, or a new perspective can arise. So I like to think of him thinking, hit someone in the mouth last week, didn't work out that well. Maybe I'll try this, you know? So it's not being passive, but it's having that openness.
Right. And like living with the mentality that you can't throw away anyone. Like we're not going to, we can draw a fine moral line, but we're not going to cancel anyone out or decide anyone's beyond, loving, which is another thing Bell Hooks, I love, said to you, like, who do I need to love today? And sometimes it's hard. You don't always get to love the cute person. Like sometimes you got to love the person who's really hard to love. I think that's a good muscle for our time as well. Kiski, I think we have time for another one.
Yeah. This one is from Dennis, and he asks, please address the problem of economic deprivation and the immense disparity of wealth in the U.S. with the government's inability or unwillingness to reduce it. How do the homeless, for example, cope with anger? Is the method that they may use comparable to what you recommend?
Well, I think that the method it's a few things. One is most of my work, say, would be with people working with the homeless, and so it seems clear that not only is there trauma for the people, say, living on the streets, there's a lot of vicarious trauma for the people trying to serve them and dealing with a seemingly intractable system. And so I think of things like mindfulness and those tools as kind of resilience tools. It's not to dampen down what you're feeling, and it doesn't obviate the need for action. It really doesn't. But the sort of self-torment and the humiliation that comes, from not having as much as somebody else, and the stories that are told about us that we absorb are also a source of pain. And so working directly with that and coming to a different place. There are some stories in the book also about people who were homeless or using benefits, using certain services. And one of the great stories in the book is about this place called the Recovery Cafe in Seattle, although I think there's some other satellites around where people go. It's, I don't know what they're doing right now. I don't know if they're open, but it was a meeting place where people would come. They had to be sober, and often they were homeless, and there were various services, and they were fed and things like that. But they had to clean it themselves. They had to take responsibility for it. They were known as clients. They weren't just recipients and or members. So it was really their place. And one of the great stories is about one of the women there who realized, because somebody else came in a state of extreme distress, and she played him some music, and she realized, I have something to give too. I have something I can offer. And so that kind of self-respect was really crucial to her own healing and ability to move on. My first thought in hearing the question was, we need a new government. We need a new system if the kind of grinding trauma of poverty. And, I know people who grew up in tremendous poverty and went through all kinds of later, different traumatic experiences. And they would say they feel the most lingering effect from the poverty of their childhood. It's a very severe and serious condition, but how do people get the energy to insist that things change? And it comes from some kind of telling a different story about who we are.
I also love that reminder. One of the things that when I've been doing some reporting on like the racial wealth gap and poverty, that I've had amazing Black women, decades long anti-poverty activists say is don't focus only on baby bonds or children, because we have this notion that children are so easy to empathize with, and that's the deserving poor sort of. And what you just said triggered for me that if we can hold, and I think this happens through mindfulness, that every human being we come across was a child, has an inner child, had experiences, that it's actually about empathizing with every single person as deserving. Any deservingness you feel towards children can be projected onto adults. We were all there, and we've all had these experiences because of the systems and structures that we're a part of, that we are all, you know, complicit in by not changing. And so anyway, I really like that reminder. I wanted to read one of my favorite quotes back to you. I feel like this is 2020 in a nutshell. You said, "To grieve, whether for a person, a set of ideals, or our hopes and dreams, is to watch reality, once so solid seeming, become molten. It's hard to get oneself to take the next step in a dissolving world. Where will our foot land when it seems nothing will support us? How do we move toward inner and outer change?" And I loved that so much because for me, it was sort of like, oh, that's so 2020. And then it was like, oh, and it was every year before 2020. Like we're experiencing this freakish version of constant change and, you know, reckoning. But really, this was always there for all of us, this sense of wrestling with constant change and wrestling with the truth versus our own delusions. And so can you say a little bit about, like, is 2020 that different? Or do you see it as like, yeah, this is like a freakish version of what the human existence is always about, really?
Well, in the great spirit of non-duality, I'll say I think it's both.
Okay. There you go.
Know, because it's freakish. And I think we have to admit that, you know, like not this year, but some years ago, I was just teaching, and this woman was clearly in some distress. And she said to me, you know, I just feel like I'm not coping and I should be better. And I don't, you know, I have had a hard year, but, you know, I should be better. I don't know why I'm not doing better. And I said, okay, what I want you to do is give me a list of everything that's happened to you this year. And she chose to draw it out instead. So she gave me this picture. And it was a lot, you know, like my cat died, my house burnt down, my brother got alienated from me, you know, and it was like, well, let's just look at this, you know, like this is a lot. And it's a lot for any one person. In some ways, I think one of the most terrible things is that we have to really be creative about creating community because it's hard to bear alone.
Yeah.
You know, and we can't do maybe the ordinary things that we have done to have a sense of community. So it's tough, but so it is really hard. And yet it's also true. I mean, things have always changed constantly. And the kind of security that we hold on to that we think gives us control was always an illusion. And we have to find a home in our bodies and our minds on this planet in another way, rather than through that effort to be in control, because it's not going to happen.
Yeah, especially not now. And don't you think when you talk about taking that first step in a dissolving world, which I think is such a good metaphor, like that is part of where the connection and the community comes in, right? Is like, if you can't in this moment in 2020 figure out what is the next step politically for me, what is the next step in terms of my activism, look around. Yeah. You know, find your most resilient friends or neighbors. You might be the resilient one next week, but like this week, if you're not feeling that, like look for someone else and see what action they're up to and just follow it. That there's nothing wrong with just spending some time looking around and creating community and doing what others who seem to be coping reasonably well are doing, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And also just like a little baby step, you know, and especially in the direction that you were talking about of connection. Like I have an apartment in New York City, which I can barely remember, but it's there. And I have spent many months, you know, in different years in New York, as well as having a home here in Massachusetts. And so I'm very in touch with people in New York, especially. And, you know, in the really terrible months of the spring, people would say things to me like, I've lived in this apartment for 12 years. I never even knew the name of a single neighbor. Now we all have one another's phone numbers and we check in on one another. Or I have a friend who's 85 and there, and he said to me, I've gotten the phone numbers of all the elderly people in my building. I noted he didn't say the other elderly people because he doesn't consider himself, I guess, older. And he said, I've gotten the names and the phone numbers of all the elderly people in my building, and I call them. and make sure they're okay. Or have a friend who, he's not in the city right now, but while he was there, he had an elderly neighbor who every single night they would meet in the hallway, sitting, probably 20 or 30 feet apart, and have a conversation. And he taught her how to meditate, so they'd meditate together. And he said, she had been an extremely active, engaged woman, and everything was shut down. There was nowhere for her to go. And she was vulnerable. So, it was just like complicated, but he was like a light in her life doing that simple thing. And I've seen that again and again.
That's so beautiful. I think that's a beautiful note to end on. And I'm just so grateful to know you and your work and be one of the many people who have benefited from your teaching and to your whole lineage. I'm grateful. It was wonderful to hear about your lineage tonight. Thanks to all of you who've joined us and joined Sharon Salzberg. If you'd like a copy of Real Change, there's going to be a link at the end of the program that you can follow to purchase from one of our independent bookstore partners. I'm Courtney Martin, and you've been watching Women Lit Unbound. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much.